She ordered a man she didn't know into her bed, the aftermath shocked. Everyone asterisked the town of Belmer prided itself on its stillness. Nestled between rolling fields and a silver thread river, it was the sort of place where nothing ever changed and everyone knew their neighbors' secrets before they were spoken aloud. Gossip was as common as the morning bread, and reputations were carefully polished or quietly destroyed over kitchen tables and church pews. In such a place, scandal was both feared and secretly craved. It gave people something to talk about when the days blurred into one another. Elena Holloway, a widow of 3 years, was one of those names always uttered in hushed tones. She carried herself with grace, never raising her voice, never breaking from the expected decorum of a woman who had once been married to a respected man. Her late husband, Peter, had been a banker, stern-faced and well-liked in public, though known in whispers for his coldness at home. Since his sudden death, Elena had lived quietly, tending her garden, helping at the parish, and never once offering the town reason to suspect she might step out of line, until that night. It was early autumn, the evening air sharp with the scent of burning wood, when a stranger arrived. He was broad-shouldered, dust-covered from the road, and his presence immediately drew stares as he entered the tavern. Outsiders were rare in Belmer. Rarer still were men who carried themselves with such quiet confidence. He ordered nothing more than bread and ale, sat at a corner table, and kept his head low. People speculated, was he a drifter, a criminal, or just passing through? No one knew, and curiosity prickled like static in the air. Elena entered the tavern not long after. That in itself was unusual. She rarely went out after dusk. She wore a dark shawl over her hair, her eyes sharp and determined. Every conversation dimmed the moment she stepped through the door. The widow Holloway was not known for dramatic entrances, and yet something about her presence that night suggested she carried a purpose that would not be ignored. Without hesitation, she crossed the floor to the stranger's table. Whispers erupted in her wake. What business could she possibly have with him? He looked up, surprised but not unsettled, as Elena stood over him. For a heartbeat, the tavern seemed to hold its breath. "I want you to come home with me," she said clearly, her voice steady enough that all who strained to listen could hear. "And I want you to sleep with me." The words dropped like stones in a still pond, sending ripples across every corner of the room. Forks clattered. Someone gasped. A man coughed to cover his shock. Women stared with wide eyes, some scandalized, others secretly intrigued. Elena's gaze never faltered. She had said what she came to say. The stranger leaned back in his chair, studying her, while the townsfolk bristled with the weight of the moment. In Belmer, where propriety was armor and appearances were law, Elena's request was not just bold, it was unthinkable. And yet she had spoken it aloud, in public, without shame. By the time the silence cracked and whispers rushed in like floodwater, it was too late. The scandal had been born, and Belmer would never be the same again. The tavern was not known for silence. Usually it buzzed with the clink of mugs and bursts of laughter, the shuffle of cards and the creak of chairs. But after Elena's words, the air grew thick, so heavy with disbelief that even the fire in the hearth seemed to falter, all eyes fixed on the stranger. He was still seated, a half-drained mug of ale in his hand, his head tilted slightly as if he were weighing a puzzle. His name was not yet known to the people of Belmer, but in that moment he held their full attention. He did not flinch, did not laugh, did not scowl as many expected he would. Instead, he regarded Elena with a look that seemed part curiosity, part recognition, as though he had been waiting for someone to ask him something just as strange. "You want me to sleep with you?" he repeated slowly. Not as a challenge, but as a confirmation. Elena stood tall, her hands folded in front of her, her chin raised. "Yes." A ripple of gasps swept through the room. Someone muttered a prayer under their breath. Another man chuckled nervously, as though waiting for the joke to reveal itself. But there was no joke in Elena's eyes. Her voice did not tremble, and the weight of her words clung to the tavern walls like smoke. The stranger set his mug down. For a long, tense pause, he looked her over, not with the crude hunger some feared, but with a deep, measuring stillness. He was deciding, and the town was desperate to know what his decision would be. "All right," he said at last. The sound of his voice, calm, low, and firm, was like the snap of a rope holding the entire room in suspense. People erupted at once. A woman dropped her spoon, which clattered against her bowl. Two men laughed in disbelief. The tavern keeper swore and muttered about the devil at work. Outside, the latecomers who had missed the words pressed their ears against the door to catch the rush of gossip spilling out. Elena inclined her head, neither triumphant nor ashamed. "Then come," she said simply, and turned toward the door. The stranger rose, towering over most of the men in the tavern. He slung a worn coat over his shoulder, nodded once to no one in particular, and followed her out. By then, the entire tavern had abandoned their meals and drinks. Chairs scraped the floor as half the crowd rushed after them. The rest stayed behind only to speculate in louder and wilder tones. Within minutes, word spilled down the main street. Elena Holloway, the widow, had invited a strange man into her home for her bed. No less. By the time Elena and the stranger reached her modest house on the edge of town, a small crowd had already gathered outside. Lanterns flickered in the night air, carried by men and women who pretended they were just passing by but stood rooted like fence posts in the grass. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. Older men shook their heads gravely while secretly craning their necks to see. Better. The stranger held the door open for Elena as though it were the most ordinary arrangement in the world. She stepped inside and he followed without a glance at the gawkers. The door shut firmly behind them. The crowd gasped as if the very closing of it sealed their disbelief. And then, like wildfire, speculation lit the town. Some said Elena had gone mad with loneliness. Others swore she had been bewitched by the stranger's dark eyes. A few whispered about bargains with spirits, about curses that needed breaking. Whatever the reason, one truth burned clear in every retelling. Elena Holloway had done what no respectable woman of Belmer had ever dared, and the stranger, nameless, fearless, had agreed. That night, the little town could not sleep. Belmer's shutters rattled not just from the autumn wind, but from the restless fever of scandal, alive and spreading in every whispered retelling. Dawn in Belmer usually arrived quietly. Roosters crowed, shopkeepers lifted shutters, and the river mist curled lazily over the fields. But on that particular morning, silence was heavy with anticipation. The whole town was awake far earlier than usual, their eyes fixed on one modest cottage at the edge of the lane, the Holloway house. The crowd from the night before had not entirely dispersed. Some had lingered under the excuse of walking home slowly. Others claimed they needed fresh air or a stroll by the river. But the truth was plain. No one wanted to miss what would happen when Elena Holloway and the stranger stepped outside. Even those who had gone to bed rose at the first streak of light, tugging on coats and shawls to join the growing cluster of onlookers. Children were hushed, baskets of bread left forgotten on doorsteps. Elena's curtains remained drawn. Smoke rose from her chimney, proof of life inside, and that alone sent whispers darting through the crowd. "They're awake. She's cooking breakfast. He's still there." Each guess was layered with scandal, spoken in tones of awe and condemnation. At last, as the sun crested the hills, the door opened. Elena appeared first. She was not disheveled, not hiding her face as many expected. Instead, she looked composed, her hair braided neatly, her shawl tied across her shoulders. There was something strikingly calm about her, as if she had not just turned the town upside down, but had merely completed a task long overdue. Behind her came the stranger. He ducked slightly beneath the doorway, his coat slung casually across one arm, his expression unreadable. Unlike Elena, who greeted the morning with quiet dignity, he seemed entirely unbothered by the dozens of eyes fixed upon him. The crowd held its collective breath. They had waited all night for this moment, certain it would end in shame or denial. But Elena did not avert her gaze. She looked straight ahead, chin high, as if daring anyone to speak first. The stranger fell into step beside her with a natural ease, not touching her, yet walking as though they were already bound by some unspoken agreement. A murmur rippled outward. "She doesn't look guilty. Why isn't she embarrassed?" They seem almost ordinary." That was the strangest part. There was no trace of regret in either of their faces. No fluster, no explanation, no hurried departure. If anything, Elena looked lighter, as though she had set down a burden that had weighed on her for years. Mrs. Carmody, the baker's wife, clutched her shawl so tightly her knuckles turned white. She's proud of it. Do you see? She's proud. She hissed, though a flicker of reluctant admiration sparked in her eyes. Others nodded uneasily, torn between outrage and fascination. The stranger met the crowd's stares briefly, then tipped his head in a courteous gesture, as though acknowledging their presence at a market rather than at the aftermath of a scandal. Without a word, he and Elena walked past the gawkers and toward the main road. The people instinctively parted to let them through, murmuring like a tide. No one dared to speak directly to Elena, but the whispers grew behind her like a storm cloud. Some were cruel, others curious, a few oddly respectful. In every corner of Belmer that morning, shops, kitchens, and schoolrooms, her name was the first on every tongue. By midday, the story had already twisted into 10 different versions. Some swore she had bewitched the man, others insisted he must be a scoundrel and she a fallen woman. But there were also those who whispered more quietly that she looked happier, freer than they had ever seen her. That perhaps she had not shamed herself at all, but broken free of the invisible chains the town had wound around her since her husband's death. One thing was certain: the morning after, Elena Holloway was no longer simply the quiet widow on the edge of town. She had become the center of its greatest scandal, and perhaps something more. By the third day, Belmer was drowning in speculation. The scandal had grown legs, arms, and a tongue of its own. It stalked the marketplace, lurked outside the chapel, and slipped into every household like an unwelcome guest. People could not decide whether to treat Elena Holloway as a sinner, a lunatic, or a woman possessed, yet Elena did not hide. She walked to the market with her basket, bought apples from Mr. Dyer, and nodded politely to the very people who whispered behind her back. The stranger who finally introduced himself as Daniel Mercer was often seen beside her, chopping wood in her yard or carrying sacks from the mill. He offered no explanation either, and that silence was maddening to Belmer. Finally, the truth began to seep out, not from gossip, but from Elena herself. It happened one evening at the parish gathering, where most of the town had crowded in to glare and gossip. The priest, a cautious man who hated conflict, urged everyone to remember charity. But the murmurs grew sharper until one woman, Mrs. Carmody, burst out, "Have you no shame, Elena Holloway? To throw yourself at a man you don't even know in front of the whole town? To behave like a harlot." The room erupted with nods and muttered agreement. Elena, seated near the back, rose slowly. Her eyes swept across the crowd, not with anger, but with something fiercer, resolve. "You want the truth?" she said, her voice carrying steady and strong. "Then I'll give it to you." The hall fell silent. Even Daniel, leaning against the wall near the door, stilled. "For years I lived with a man who told me every day that I was worthless," Elena began. "Peter Holloway was praised in this town as respectable, generous, upright. But in our home, he called me barren. He told me I was broken, less than a woman, unfit to be loved." "And you believed him, every one of you, because you never saw me with a child." Gasps flickered around the room. Elena's shoulders squared. "Yes, he told you all that lie, and you carried it for him. You pitied me in whispers, pitied my empty house. And I bore it year after year until the day he died." Her voice caught, but she pressed on. "But grief did not free me. His words stayed, echoing in your stares, in your pity, in the way you lowered your voices when I passed. You kept his curse alive for him." A woman in the front row shifted uncomfortably. An older man looked down at his shoes. "So I chose," Elena said, her chin lifting. "I chose a man who owed none of you anything. A stranger. Someone untouched by this town's poison. I asked him to lay with me, not for love, not for lust, but to prove that I am not what Peter made me believe, that I am not broken, that I am free to live as I wish without your approval." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Daniel's gaze on her was steady, proud even, though he did not speak. Mrs. Carmody sputtered, "That's no excuse," but her voice wavered. For every glare fixed on Elena, There were eyes glistening with something else, recognition, sympathy, even envy. Because in Belmer, many women knew the weight of whispered judgments, the chains of silent expectations. And for the first time, one of their own had stood up and cut through them. Elena did not ask for forgiveness. She did not need it. She sat down again, calm and unbowed, leaving the town to wrestle with a truth they had never expected to hear. The parish hall emptied that night in a strange silence. People shuffled homeward with stiff shoulders and uneasy glances, but the quiet was deceptive. By morning, Belmer was split clean in two. On one side stood those who clung tightly to their outrage. To them, Elena's confession was no defense but an even greater scandal. They said a widow should remain modest, reserved, and above all obedient to the moral code the town had clung to for generations. Suffering is a woman's lot, Mrs. Carmody declared loudly to anyone who would listen. She should have borne it in silence. Instead, she flaunts her shame like a badge. These were the voices that rang the loudest in the marketplace and after Sunday service, pointing at Elena as though her courage was contagion. But there was another side now, smaller yet growing. Quiet voices, mostly among the women, who admitted to themselves, if not always aloud, that Elena's act had shaken something deep inside them. At the dressmaker's shop, whispers passed between stitches. Can you imagine? To stand up and say those things after all these years? At the milliner's counter, another murmured, perhaps she isn't wicked at all. Perhaps she's braver than the rest of us. Even men were divided. Some scoffed that Elena was dangerous, an example that needed stamping out before wives and daughters grew bold. Others, particularly the younger ones, confessed they admired Daniel's calm defiance, his refusal to bow to Belmer's gossip. A few even admitted, grudgingly, that they respected Elena for speaking truths no one else dared. The children, of course, repeated everything they heard. Schoolyards buzzed with stories, each one grander than the last. By week's end, half the town's youth believed Elena had cast a spell on Daniel, while the other half whispered that she was a secret heroine. Through it all, Elena herself remained unflinching. She carried on as though the world had not turned itself upside down. She baked bread, tended her garden, and walked through the square with Daniel at her side. That alone unsettled the town more than anything else, not the scandal itself, but her refusal to shrink beneath it. Daniel became part of the town's rhythm in his own way. He offered his labor freely, chopping wood for widows, mending fences for farmers, and earning grudging gratitude from men who had first muttered about his presence. He never boasted, never explained himself, and that mystery only deepened Belmer's obsession. One afternoon, as Elena crossed the square with a basket of apples, a young woman named Margaret followed her into the lane. "Mrs. Holloway," she whispered, cheeks flushed, I just wanted to say, I think what you did was brave." Then, before Elena could reply, Margaret hurried off, her courage spent but her message delivered. It was the first of many such confessions, quiet and hurried, spoken in corners and doorways. Women who had suffered cruel husbands or who bore the weight of expectations they could never fulfill began to see Elena not as a sinner but as a mirror. The men of power in Belmer, the elders and church leaders, tried to smother the shift with stern sermons and heavy words about morality. But something had been stirred that could not be so easily silenced. For every wagging tongue that called Elena shameless, there was another that began to wonder if she was, in fact, the freest woman in town. And as autumn deepened into winter, Belmer found itself standing on the edge of change, torn between its traditions and the unsettling spark of rebellion ignited by one widow's scandalous choice. Winter arrived in Belmer with brittle winds and heavy skies, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the frost of silence or the fire of conversation that followed Elena Holloway wherever she went. By then, months had passed since that fateful night in the tavern. Yet her name had not left the town's lips. At first, it seemed the scandal would consume her. The harshest tongues predicted she would be driven out, forced to leave her home, branded forever as the woman who had broken Belmer's fragile moral code. But Elena never left. Instead, she dug her heels into the earth of her garden, fed her hens, and sat on her porch with Daniel at dusk, Visible for all to see, her refusal to vanish became her quietest act of defiance, and, strangely, her greatest shield. The longer she stayed, the harder it became for people to condemn her without exhausting themselves. What could they say that hadn't already been said? What punishment could they inflict on a woman who refused to bow her head in shame? Slowly, the conversation began to shift. At the bakery, women who once whispered behind their hands now discussed Elena's courage more openly. She spoke the truth, Mrs. Hanley admitted one morning as she counted out her coins for bread. And you know what? She looked lighter afterward, happier. Maybe that's worth something. At the tavern, where it had all begun, younger men began to chuckle not with scorn but with admiration. "Took guts, what she did," one said over his pint. "And he stayed, didn't he? If that doesn't mean something, I don't know what does." Even the church softened its tone. The priest, pressed by growing sympathy in his congregation, shifted his sermons from condemnation to more cautious themes: forgiveness, renewal, the power of truth. He never praised Elena outright, but his silence on the matter was enough to let the embers of hostility cool. Daniel remained at Elena's side through it all. He found work as a laborer, his steady presence slowly reshaping the town's perception of him from scandalous stranger to dependable neighbor. Where once they muttered about his dark past, now they grudgingly admitted he was a good hand with the axe or reliable when the barn roof leaks. His loyalty to Elena, unspoken but unwavering, became the foundation of her new reputation. By spring, Belmar was not the same town it had been. It still gossiped always, but the bite had dulled. Women who had long suffered quietly under the weight of their husbands' words now found themselves standing a little straighter, speaking a little bolder. Men who once dismissed their wives began to sense the tide shifting. However subtly, Elena never sought to become a symbol, yet she had become one all the same. Her scandal was retold less as an outrage and more as a turning point, a story about the day Belmar's silence cracked, when one widow chose defiance over despair and changed the way people thought about shame, truth, and freedom. And as for Elena herself, she lived her days with a steadiness that confounded those who had once mocked her. She tended her home, shared meals with Daniel, and walked the town with her head high. If anyone dared to call her shameless now, she only smiled faintly, as if the word no longer had power over her. In time, her story became less about scandal and more about courage. Children grew up hearing it not as a warning but as a legend of the widow who asked a stranger to sleep with her, and in doing so unchained an entire town from its fear of whispers. And so the act that once shocked Belmar became its most enduring tale, the story of how one woman's bold choice rewrote the rules of a town that had once thought itself unchangeable.